Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for being here. I just want to follow up on some of the points that Senator Johnson has made. So, as I understand it, the purpose of the Universal Service Fund is really to build out capacity. It used to be hard lines. Now we're looking at broadband because of what we're talking about today in terms of an IP transition, which makes sense in terms of technology. I represent a state that gets really shortchanged under this fund, 37 cents on the dollar, and I'd love to have any of you drive around New Hampshire with me in the rural areas, and you can see that we really do have very much needs that aren't being addressed. So I've introduced legislation to make it more equitable, reform this fund. So I want the FCC to act further to reform what happens with universal service. But Mr. Banks, when we're thinking about this percentage that Mr. Johnson, Senator Johnson asked you about, really what we're talking about perhaps is areas where, rural areas where you're not going to have the business incentive to build out capacity, and that, as I understand it, was why we have the Universal Service Fund. So what's your thoughts in terms of IP transition as a way of really, I think, hopefully more effectively using the Universal Service Fund? And what opportunities do you see for rural America with the Universal Service Fund and this IP transition?
Yes.
And please correct me if I'm wrong in terms of what I think the purpose of this fund is in terms of what we're trying to accomplish here.
No, you're absolutely right. The purpose of the USF fund is to connect Americans. The FCC is engaged in a major reform of a big part of that fund, the part of the fund for larger companies, and increasing the funding available to larger companies to serve people who wouldn't be served otherwise. The FCC, that was an FCC 2011 reform order. The FCC is still working to implement that, to operationalize it. Hopefully that will be in place by 2015. And for the larger companies, funds will flow in a much more targeted way, more funds to connecting people in census blocks where they have no options, no other service.
What about the smaller companies as well? I mean, as we think about this IP transition, how do we think it'll impact competition? I think that's an important issue for consumers, and also as we look at a reform of the USF fund. And, you know, I've heard a lot of concerns, obviously, with this transition from rural carriers as well.
So part two of the USF reform is reforming the smaller company, the rural company fund. The FCC made some reforms that were ill-advised. To the FCC's credit, and Chairman Wheeler, he's taken those off the table and is going to issue a notice of rulemaking to modernize the fund for rural carriers, just like they modernized the fund for larger carriers. That's a very big deal and very important to get that right. In terms of rural carriers and the IP transition, many rural carriers have invested heavily in broadband and fiber and IP. So in many rural areas, IP services are available. The right reform of the fund should help a lot with that.
Mr. Schulzring, would you like to comment on this? I'm sure you have some thoughts on it.
Yeah, let me comment on the technical aspect. Thank you for the question. The IP transition, unlike in the older days where essentially rural meant you had to extend copper lines to remote areas, now offers several choices that will make it hopefully possible to cost-effectively reach all Americans, whether that's through fiber, the long-term probably preferred option in terms of capability, extending the capability of copper, fixed wireless, and in really remote areas, satellite. It is important to provide robust broadband to all Americans that allows modern applications, voice as well as video and other applications to function well. And indeed, to explore these technologies in new ways of providing broadband, robust broadband services as part of a reform effort that Mr. Banks mentioned, we're looking at an experiment to provide funding to both traditional and non-traditional providers to extend broadband into rural areas. We have received over 1,000 indications of interest from a wide variety of organizations, electric utilities, traditional carriers, communities working with these organizations to explore providing robust, mostly fiber, but also robust wireless services into areas that are not currently being served. So I believe that technology transition gives us additional opportunity to do that cost effectively and on a schedule which may be more aggressive than what we've been able to do in the past, where we had to rely on one technology only.
Well, that's actually would be good news, for many rural areas, because as you know, having the ability to connect can determine the economic viability of rural areas as well. So I see this as a very important jobs issue. So thank you.